Thank you very much. And what an absolute pleasure it is to be here with all of you today. The Global Forum for Recruitment Reform, perhaps really the event that we have been waiting for in a number of ways. And we're looking forward to a very engaging discussion today with trade union leaders from around the world. In a large part of the conversations that we've been having, it is important to recognize the role that trade unions have to play when it comes to migrant workers' rights, and specifically then also in the context of recruitment reform, fair recruitment, and in the way migrant workers undergo the migration journey in the context of recruitment particularly. First, from my side, let me take this opportunity to wish all South Asians, and majority of Asians, in fact, because I'm the South Asia Labor Migration Specialist, a very happy New Year. This week is a big week for most of us in Asia, so happy New Year to all the folks present here today. This is going to be a multilingual session, so we're going to have an Arabic speaker, so feel free and make sure you select the language of your preference on your screen as you engage and listen to the participants themselves. As I said, it's such a pleasure to be here today with some very good speakers, experts, trade union leaders. Fair recruitment and fair migration, they are clearly trade union issues. I mean, I've been with some of the panelists here, whether it's Laxman Basnet, whether it's Shannon Lederer, Elizabeth Tang, and Hasan. I have been with them in different settings where I've had the opportunity of seeing how particularly they bring in trade union perspectives in the broader schemes on migration and migrants' rights. So to even try and justify the role that trade unions play in the context of recruitment would be a disservice. In fact, I remember the moment in 2018 when we had a whole range of conversations in defining recruitment fees and related costs. And I remember Shannon at the time was perhaps one of our trade union representatives and leading the trade union voices in defining those recruitment fees and related costs thematic discussion. Now, the ILO principles and guidelines for fair recruitment encourage trade unions to take the following actions. So bear with me as I give you 4 of these actions. The first, and perhaps foremost, provide more and better services to their members who might have encountered challenges during their recruitment processes. Key word here for me, members. The second, better promote fair recruitment nationally as well as across international borders, and therefore recognizing that fair recruitment guidelines are applicable not just for international migration, but for recruitment as a whole. Number 3, influence and strengthen regulatory, monetary, and enforcement mechanisms to address abusive and fraudulent recruitment practices. And we are going to be hearing about some of those recruitment practices today from the trade union perspective. And number 4, support the application and implementation of international labor standards and human rights instruments by actively participating in formulating legislation and policies at all levels, whether specifically sectorial levels, industry, national, regional, international. And that leads me to say, also to recognize that this participation is perhaps one of the most difficult issues itself for trade unions in a number of countries around the world. Nonetheless, I want to now take you to the panelists, to the esteemed panelists themselves. The panelists here come from different parts of the world, as I mentioned. I would like to first introduce Brother Hasan Alhalwachi. Brother Hasan is from the GFBTU in Bahrain. In fact, he joined the Bahrain National Gas Company, where he was trained by the company within a professional training program on the extraction and treatment of associate gas. And then he progressed from a position of trainee to a position of shift supervisor. And I wanted to perhaps highlight that element, Brother Hasan, because very clearly you have risen through the ranks as a worker and you have gotten to where you are as a trade union leader. There is so much more I could say about Brother Hasan, but I'm going to refrain because I tell you, all of our panelists here today deserve much more than any of the introductions that I will be ever be able to give. Sister Shannon Ledra, I think this is the first time I'm referring to Shannon as sister, but Shannon, such a pleasure to have you as well. Shannon Ledra is the Director of Immigration Policy for AFL-CIO in the United States, works with union affiliates and allies in all sectors of the labor movement to develop and advance policies that promote workers' rights and shared prosperity. Now, since she first began working with Filipino teachers who had been trafficked into jobs in US public schools, she recognized that we cannot expect to lift labor standards in our country until all people working here are assured fundamental rights and protections. Shannon, what an absolute pleasure, coming also from the fact that teachers today are as much frontline workers as any of the other medical professionals who are out there. The fourth speaker will be Mr. Laxman Basnet, Brother Laxman Basnet. Laxman Ji, as I refer to him, comes from Nepal. Namaste, Laxman Ji. Laxman Basnet is the General Secretary of the South Asian Regional Trade Union Confederation. Laxman Ji is the former president of the Nepal Trade Union Congress, currently the General Secretary of SARTUC, and he started his political career as an activist for the Nepali Congress in 1967. If I may say this, today, a lot of conversations in South Asia have been taken forward, have been buoyed by Mr. Laxman Basnet. He has been an integral part of the advocacy, not just for migrant workers' rights, but for a strong engagement for trade unions across the region. So I'm very happy to welcome Laxman Basnet. And our fourth speaker, Elizabeth Tang. Sister Tang is the General Secretary of the International Domestic Workers Federation. I can tell you this, in just South Asia alone, we face a feminization of migration. And a lot of the women who have been migrating have been in precarious forms of employment, particularly in domestic work sector. In fact, Elizabeth has been the General Secretary of the IDWF now, and is which IDWF, as you know, is a membership-based global organization of domestic and household workers. The organization's objective is to build a strong, democratic, and united domestic and household workers global organization to protect and advance domestic workers' rights everywhere. Indeed, and certainly, I remember during the drafting of the Domestic Workers Convention, C-189, way back in 2010, 2011, when it was adopted, the active participation of Elizabeth, the IDWF, and the others. So, Elizabeth, welcome to you as well. I will first turn to Brother Hasan, who will be speaking to us in Arabic. So please feel free to switch on to your translation. Brother Hasan, here's a question. And for me, it's going to be very impressive listening to you because of the experience that you come as a worker yourself. As a South Asian, and as working for the ILO in South Asia, one of the things that I've always been struck by is the fact that there is always a difficulty in conversations surrounding trade unionism, trade union membership, and migrant workers' rights in the Middle East. It's complex, and we all accept that. But here, you come now, or you represent GFBTU, a trade union in Bahrain, that is specifically organizing migrant workers. what is it that GFBTU has done, and how did you do it in terms of organizing migrant workers that we could perhaps also see in other countries? What triggered this? Love to hear from you on that.
شكرا صبري على المقدمة الجميلة. طبعا في الاتحاد العام لنقابات عمال البحرين المبادئ الأساسية التي قام عليها الاتحاد هي أنه يكون مسؤولا عن جميع العمال باختلاف لغتهم ومنشئهم والبلد الذي ينتمون إليه. في الاتحاد العام أيضا نحث العمالة المهاجرة بالانخراط في العمل النقابي وأن يتبوأوا أيضا مناصب اتخاذ القرار. وفي البحرين عندنا، أو في الاتحاد العام لنقابات عمال البحرين، عندنا أكثر من نقابة في مجلس إدارتها تحتوي على نماذج من العمالة المهاجرة، وهم فعلا فعالين لأنهم يعتبرون الذراع الذي ممكن أن يعتمد عليه الاتحاد العام للتواصل مع العمالة الأجنبية. في البحرين أو حتى بشكل عام في العالم هناك أكثر من 250 مليون مهاجر. في الخليج العربي فقط هناك 25 مليون مهاجر. في البحرين في أكثر من نصف مليون مهاجر. نسبة المنضمين إلى الاتحاد العام لا تتجاوز 10% من العمالة المهاجرة، وهذا يضع على كاهلنا مسؤولية كبيرة للتواصل مع العمالة المهاجرة. طبعا هناك صعوبات كثيرة التي أنت تكلمت عنها قبل قليل. من أهم هذه الصعوبات اختلاف اللغة، اختلاف الثقافة المجتمعية أو الثقافة لكل بلد على حدة، صعوبة التواصل، وأعني هنا التواصل أن تصل إلى المناطق التي تعمل فيها العمالة المهاجرة، وكون هذه العمالة عادة تعمل إلى ساعات طويلة من بداية الصباح إلى حتى المساء، ولا يكون هناك وقت كافي بالنسبة لعامل قد عمل أكثر من 10 ساعات أن يجلس ويستمع إلى جلسة توعوية بحقوق العمال. كل هذه الصعوبات استطعنا أن نتحداها وأن نتغلب عليها وأن نتواصل مع العمال. اليوم عندما نتكلم عن المسؤولية للتوظيف العادل على مستوى العالم، يشعر الاتحاد العام لنقابات عمال البحرين بأن هذه الجزئيات التي موجودة في منظمة العمل الدولية كبرنامج العمل اللائق، أيضا الموجودة في ميثاق الهجرة الدولية GCM وفي الMO، وكل هذه تتكامل مع بعضها البعض لتكون منظورة أو منظومة متكاملة لحفظ حقوق العمالة المهاجرة. نحن من الاتحاد العام ندعو إلى الخروج عن الأنماط الاعتيادية التي تقوم بها الاتحادات العام أو الاتحادات النقابية أو المنظمات النقابية في التواصل مع العمال وفي نشر الوعي الكافي بهذه الحقوق، لأنها باتت اليوم مسألة إنسانية بحتة، وهي لا تنفك كحق من حقوق الإنسان المتفق عليها على مستوى العالم. وبالتالي يجب أن نخرج على النمطية المعتادة في كل ما يخص العمالة المهاجرة، سواء من نشر التوعية، التواصل، التعريف بالحقوق، الدفاع عن هؤلاء الفئة الكبيرة من العمال. أنا اليوم أتكلم من البحرين، ولا أضمن في المستقبل أن يكون أحد أبنائي أو أحد بناتي مهاجرا في دولة أخرى. فبالتالي هذه المنظومة لا يمكن لأحد أن يقول أنها لا تخصني، لأنها كما قلت هي على قدر كبير في المساس من حقوق الإنسان الأساسية الموجودة. أصبحت هذه هموم مشتركة بين جميع المنظمات العالمية الموجودة، وأخص هنا المنظمات النقابية كونها مسؤولة مباشرة عن حقوق العمال. نحن في الاتحاد العام واجهنا الكثير من المشاكل، وأيضا استطعنا أن نتغلب عليها. هناك مجموعة من العمال في ما يسمى بقضية سي لورد، سفينة كانت عالقة في البحر، وسفينة أخرى اسمها سيري كوبار، والتي استمرت المحاكمة عليها لأكثر من 5 سنوات في البحرين، واستطعنا مؤخرا أن نخرج حقوق العمال، وأن نحن في مرحلة تعويض هؤلاء العمال بمستحقاتهم، حيث أنزلناهم من على اليابسة بعد أن كانوا لمدة أكثر من 9 أشهر لا يرون إلا البحر فقط، يرون الماء من كل جهة. استطعنا أن نجلب هؤلاء إلى اليابسة وأن ندافع عن حقوقهم. ومع الأسف أقولها بمرارة بأن أغلب هؤلاء العمال مع أنهم كانوا على وعي كبير ومتعلمون، لم يكن أي أحد منهم منضم إلى نقابة عمالية، سواء كانت هذه النقابة أساسية أو نقابة قطاعية أو حتى مظلة اتحاد أكبر. أقول في هذه العجالة نحن محتاجون إلى رفع الوعي. أنا أعلم أن قطاع كبير من العمال الذين يعملون في الخليج العربي ربما لا تتأتى لهم الفرصة بأن يكونوا المتعلمون جيدون وأن يعون بمخاطر المهنة التي يقومون بها. لا يعرفون الكثير عن عقد العمل، لا يعرفون الكثير عن منظومة العمل في البلد الذي يقصدونه، لا يعرفون الكثير عن عقد العمل العادل، عقد العمل اللائق، عقد العمل بشكل عام، حقوقه في عقد العمل، أجره العادل، الحماية الاجتماعية، الرعاية الصحية، كل ما إلى ذلك.
You're right. I think you've covered quite a few points there, because I want to quickly check in with you on a follow-up question exactly on those elements, because it's important to capture. There's quite a few things that you've said. In fact, as you were saying it and as you were talking about this being such a humane issue, that as you were talking about this being a system that touches basic human rights, and I'm thinking today is also the start of Ramadan. So Ramadan Kareem to all our, and Ramadan Mubarak to all our Muslim brothers and sisters out there. But here's that question then. When you know, the Ceylon example that you give, right? Which is such an important example. And I wasn't aware of this myself. And you talk about how migrant workers didn't have their basic rights. Well, let's give an example then. How do you then join, or, you know, when migrant workers are not aware of this, you obviously want to communicate this with the trade unions, your counterparts, your brothers and sisters in South Asia, in Sri Lanka, as an example. And one of the things that you have done very well in this context is the kind of partnerships that you have brought in. GFBTU, as a federation, like you said, has come in with partnerships with a few trade unions in South Asia. So, for instance, GFont in Nepal is a good example. Now, in that kind of a setting, what are the key elements? What are those specific points when you draft a memorandum of understanding with your counterparts, with trade unions in South Asia, in specific countries? What is it in particular that they can do in ensuring the worker protection? And how will these MOUs really be effective? Because this is of massive importance for us. We're constantly talking about having more partnerships along these lines. And you have experience here. I'd love to hear from you on that as well, Hasan.
شكرا صبري. مذكرة التفاهم بين الاتحاد العام لنقابة عمال البحرين والاتحاد النيبالي جيفونت مضى عليها أكثر من حوالي 6 سنوات، وقعت في عام 2015، وكانت مبنية على أساس أن يكون هناك منسق من الجالية النيبالية يتواصل مع العمالة النيبالية. دعني أكون هنا حقيقيا وواقعيا معك في هذه التجربة. وقلت مسبقا أيضا يجب أن تخرج الاتحادات على الأنماط الاعتيادية. هذا أحد الأنماط الذي دعني أقول وبصراحة لم يكن ناجحا بالشكل المطلوب الذي كنا نتمنى أن يكون عليه. والتقيت في 2018 وعلى هامش المؤتمر منظمة العمل الدولية مع رئيس الاتحاد النيبالي، كان وقتها منتخب جديد، وحاولت مناقشة مذكرة التفاهم فيما بيننا. الآن تتبلور أفكار أخرى بالنسبة للاتحاد العام GFBTU في البحرين، ونحن يجب أن نستخدم المظلات والمنظمات الدولية، الاتحاد الدولي للنقابات ITUC، الاتحادات القطاعية مثل قطاع الصناعات، اتحاد البناء والأخشاب. يجب أن يكون هناك تواصل فيما بيننا بحيث يكون بلد المنشأ الذي تخرج منه هذه العمالة المهاجرة يحتوون أو عندهم وعي ولو بدرجة بسيطة عن ماهية العمل اللائق، ماهية المسؤولية في التوظيف العادل، ماهية الهجرة العادلة. كل هذه الأشياء نصطدم في، يعني لا أقول الكل، ولكن جزء كبير من العمالة يأتون إلى منطقتنا في الخليج العربي وهم يجهلون أبسط مفردات هذه الأمور. لا يمكن للاتحاد العام أو لأي أحد، وهنا لا أخلي مسؤوليتي، هذه مسؤوليتي التي يجب أن أطلع بها وأقوم بالتوعية وأقوم بالتوجيه، ولكن أقول يجب أن يكون هناك عمل مشترك أوسع مما هو عليه في السابق. يجب أن لا يعتمد على وجود منسق، على وجود فرد. يجب أن يكون هناك منظومة عمل تبدأ من بلد المنشأ، ونتحمل مسؤوليتنا نحن كاتحاد وهم كاتحاد في وجود عوامل مشتركة ومعلومات مشتركة نحرص أن تكون موجودة عند العامل، حتى لما يأتي إلى البلد المهاجر إليه يفهم اللغة التي أنا أتكلم بها معه عن هذه الأمور في مجملها. ولذلك نحن بحاجة اليوم إلى تحديث هذه الأنماط. في البحرين أنشأنا 7 ممثلين لجاليات أجنبية. هؤلاء الممثلون نلتقي بهم مرة واحدة في الشهر، وهم فاعلون على مستوى الجاليات، ولكن أيضا يواجهون صعوبات في التواصل مع فئة العمال. نحن نطلب أن نتواصل مع فئة العمال وليس الجاليات كجاليات بشكل عام. أقمنا أكثر من فعالية واحتفالية لتجميع هذه الجاليات، ولكن دعني أن أكون معك صريحا وصادقا، لم نتوصل إلى الأهداف التي نريدها. في البحرين نبني الآن مفهوم مجتمعي أو ثقافة مجتمعية عن حقوق العمالة المهاجرة، ولكن في المقابل هذه الفعاليات التي التقينا فيها مع مجاميع كبيرة من العمالة المهاجرة كانوا يفتقدون إلى أبسط مفاهيم ومبادئ هذه الثقافة التي نحن ننوي أن نبنيها في المجتمع البحريني. فأقول نحتاج أيضا إلى المنظمات الدولية أن يكون لها دور راعي من خلال المؤتمرات، من خلال تجميعنا، من خلال وضع أهداف مشتركة للوصول إلى هذه الفئة من العمال المهاجرة وضمان حقوقها.
No, thanks, Brother Hasan. I appreciate what you're saying, and I think it's important to recognize this here. You know, you're right. There needs to be communication across the board with different sectors and so on. You know, and I think that's actually a good point to also raise with our next speaker, Shannon Ledra, because Shannon, Hasan just spoke about how there seems to be a difference in the way migrant workers, the cultures, and almost, if I'm not mistaken, Hasan perhaps alluded to the clash of civilizations and the clash of cultures. And you know, I'm thinking about what you and I, all those conversations that I've had with you in New York on the sidelines of the Global Compact for Migration negotiations, and which Hasan actually alluded to. We know that Objective 6 was perhaps one of those objectives which was really, really difficult. It was a difficult negotiation, that particular objective. Shannon, what are those 3 big, if I had to ask you 3 big challenges, right, that migrant workers face, linking specifically to recruitment practices? What would those challenges be? Also, if you could come in on some of the points that Brother Hasan made. Over to you, Shannon.
Yes, of course. Thank you so much, Shbari. It's an honor to be with you and these inspiring panelists for this important conversation. And thanks for asking the big questions. As you all know, and I think and hope everyone attending this conference knows, migrant workers face remarkably consistent patterns of abuse in the recruitment process, no matter where they come from, or where they're going, or what type of work they do. We see these same problems around the world and across the wage and skill spectrum. So rather than focus on what form those problems take, I think it's important to focus on the underlying structural issues that have allowed such pervasive abuses to occur and persist. In other words, rather than looking at recruitment fees as the challenge, I'm going to urge us to look at them as the symptom of a deeper systemic issue, because I think the context in which recruitment is occurring directly affects the practices the recruitment industry employs. And we can only hope to change those practices when we commit to addressing the underlying conditions that have allowed rampant abuses to go largely unchecked for decades. So I don't believe we're going to realize real gains in fair recruitment through narrow tinkering. And the three challenges I think need more focus are these. One, lack of decent work. Two, missing and also misdirected state enforcement. And three are the asymmetries in power and information in our global system. So let me talk a bit more about each and try to convince you why. So first, lack of decent work in origin countries is what makes migration a means of survival rather than a choice. When you're migrating to prevent your family from starving, you can be forced to accept terrible terms because you feel you have no other options. And that obviously needs to change. And of course, the lack of decent work challenges continue in destination countries where migrants, even those in regular labor migration programs, have real constraints on their fundamental rights. They often work under grueling conditions, are excluded from social protections, and very rarely have avenues for real social dialogue. In other words, they have work, but not decent work. And they still face far too much risk if they speak out about violations of their rights. So patterns of abuse have become entrenched as a result. So that's paramount and one. The next major challenge relates to enforcement. In many parts of the world, and I'll use the United States as an example, there is absolutely no regulation of the foreign labor recruitment industry. The state has abdicated its responsibility to protect migrant workers coming through our work visa programs, which has a very real and often tragic consequences for workers. And what we see instead of enforceable recruiter regulation is a proliferation of voluntary codes or standards that the industry itself rolls out to say it is addressing the issues. So I'll refrain from questioning the intentions of those codes, but I will simply say that from the perspective of unions, unless and until there are effective enforcement mechanisms, they're practically meaningless to workers. Unfortunately, if migrant workers do encounter enforcement officials in destination countries, they are far more likely to be immigration agents than labor agents. Sticking with the US example, we spend a shocking 12 times more to enforce immigration laws than to enforce the labor laws meant to protect our entire workforce, 170 million workers. And these skewed priorities create conditions where we hear terms like illegal used to describe workers, right? While employers can actively steal wages from those workers or expose them to life-threatening working conditions or commit other crimes with virtually no fear of consequence. And then finally, we know that workers face these challenges due to asymmetries of power and of information. So for most migrants, the only source of information they have about job prospects abroad comes through a recruiter who holds all the cards. And let's be clear, this is a behemoth industry. The World Employment Confederation alone reports annual profits that exceed global remittances. Just think about that for a minute. And we know WEC is just a portion of the industry. So we're talking about massive amounts of power and money from an industry that has been highly successful in preventing regulation. And there is no way that individual workers can take on these structures and these powerful forces alone.
Now, this is very interesting. And yes, I'm now going to digest that last fact that you gave me, because I'm thinking, every time we talk about migration in South Asia, we always talk about how much remittances countries in South Asia receive. And to think that remittances in South Asia, in a country, for instance, where I come from, where I'm currently based, in India, $82 billion in 2019, how much more did migrant workers from India have to pay? Perhaps, huh? I think that kind of a conversation is good and it's important. Lack of decent work, you start there. And I can tell you when Laxman ji speaks next after you, he's going to be talking about lack of decent work, certainly as a big reason in the South Asian context from the country of origin. Here's the other question then. How do we resolve this? What is the solution? I mean, you've listed the challenges. What specifically do we need to do differently? What can trade unions do?
Yeah, well, I'm glad you asked that. Of course, the answer has to do with the title of this panel, right? We have to organize, to build power, to change the system, the systems that have allowed these abuses, right? We need more workers of all types of status to be able to form and join unions and lift conditions on the job. We need more models of cross-border organizing and representation, like the one that we just heard, from Brother Hasan. We need more tools, like the International Trade Union Confederation's recruitment advisor site, where workers themselves can share information and experiences about the industry. We need to build that power so that in our national context, we can insist on greater investment in labor standards enforcement that keeps all workers safe on the job, whatever their status. And we need to demand binding regulations of the recruitment industry, of course, in keeping with the ILO principles and guidelines, and concrete protections for migrant workers who file claims. And of course, particularly coming out of this pandemic, right, we need to have a vision for a new social contract with no exclusions that promotes decent work for all, so that migration can really be a choice, right, rather than a means of survival. And in particular, we need to remove the barriers to freedom of association for all workers, which means that we have to reform our labor migration programs so that worker status is not controlled by employers. And we have to promote regularization for stock populations of migrants in our workforce and our unions so they can access full rights and protections. We can and we must win these changes. As they always do, workers will lead the fight in campaign after campaign. Nurses, hotel workers, farm workers, construction workers, and others on this panel are coming together to tackle these systemic issues. And I know that ultimately that's how we're going to get a more just system.
Wow. I mean, talk about implementation and enforcement of labor standards right there. When you talk about the ILO Fair Recruitment Guidelines as an example, and my colleague Maria here, who has been so actively involved in this for really a long time now, in the context of that kind of work, that is actually one of the bigger challenges. And this is just a guideline. This is a guideline. This is a reference point. And then going beyond that into conventions, into the standards, the normative frameworks, maybe those are also tools that needs to be pushed as strongly by unions. But this is fantastic and great. Thanks so much, Shannon, for those insights. I go to Laxman Basnet now. Laxman ji, my very first question to you is actually linked directly to the points that Brother Hasan made. And the points that came from Brother Hasan specifically spoke about how migrant workers don't have the right information, don't have the right perspectives before they come into the country of destination. Can you give us an example, Laxman, of one concrete example, 2 minutes, if you were to say, look, Shabri, this is what Sartuk is doing. Sartuk, not just Sartuk, but its affiliates in 6 countries in South Asia, which is one of the biggest migration hotspots in the world. What would that one concrete example be, Laxman?
Okay. The fair recruitment practices, the ILO conditionalities, has left Geneva, but it has not reached to the population of South Asia. This is a fact. And what we are trying to do, bring the trade unions and tell them that take this fair recruitment to the common workers, those who are aspiring to go to GCC countries and GCC countries and Malaysia for betterment of their life, as Sanan described, for getting out of the poverty. But because of the misinformation, they land up in India, Sri Lanka, and other countries, country of transition. And not only they land, because they are taken by the recruiters. The recruiters do not have identification. They can be working for anybody. And I have personally seen that recruiters take people out of the airports in a line so that they do not meet anybody. This is the practical. And the whole thing is, the information is not disseminated to the prospect of migrant workers, those who want to go. This is what we are telling, that you organize the migrant workers for the benefit of correct information. You can earn almost twice as much, because the kind of contract is shown is not valid in the country of destination. As soon as you leave the airport, or you reach the country of destination, the employer says, this contract is not valid in our country. It is good for your own country. So they tear it off and throw it in the dustbin. From there, he starts as a practically slave. So this is what we are saying, that the right information should go to the it's not even pre-departure, pre-conception. Okay, when I am 18 years old and I'm eligible for the passport, I think that, okay, I go out to GCC countries or Malaysia or anywhere and make my life better. But he doesn't understand that what kind of pitfalls are there. And they come up in a situation where they are taken back in their country in the boxes. And we see in our region every day many boxes are coming from the GCC countries and Malaysia every day. So what I think is most important thing is right information, preparing the migration. The pre-departure training is given at the airport, and you sign it at the airport, and you don't know what document you signed, and you don't know where are you going. And at the flight, you ask your next seat passenger to fulfill everything, migration cards. This is the real situation. I have a very one situation 100 years ago in 1914. A friend of mine who was ambassador from India to Romania, he took me, Laxman, I'll take you to a place. So he took me a place and he said, okay, this is the Nepali guy who died in First World War. And he is from Nepal. After 100 years, the same situation is repeating. We are not training our people. The remittance we are receiving is about around 10 billion now. It can be double or tripled by just giving correct information to them, to the migrant workers. Prepare them for skill development and prepare them for what is happening in the country of destination. They don't know what is a decent work. Decent work never heard. They're just looking for a better life in the country of destination. And they end up into a very sorry state. This is what I wanted to tell you. And you will hear about it in newspaper in Nepal and other places. Every day you see that he paid such a huge amount for going to the GCC country that his family had to pawn his land, his gold, his animals, everything. This is the everyday story. Thank you.
Absolutely, Laxmanji. I really appreciate everything that you've just said. I think a good way to start any campaign or advocacy is by actually telling them, if your workers are going to go fairly, if they're going to be fairly recruited, then guess what? They're going to be sending back more money. I think that's a very good way of stating that. And I like that. That's a fantastic advocacy line right there, a campaign line
Not
right there.
Not only that. You can tell the trade union, if you want to expand your membership base, one person you serve in GCC countries, like friends like Hasan, if they can take care of it, you have 5 more members in your country, country of origin, in your trade union. Make one member in GCC country, you add 5 members in your country of origin. Thank you.
Sure. No, absolutely. I hear you on all those fronts, and the fact that workers are coming back in boxes, you call them coffins, are what they really are. And I can imagine this is massive. But I also know SARTUC has done some very concrete work on the ground. SARTUC has engaged with the SAARC. The very fact that the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation today has a plan of action all started with a strong engagement from the side of SARTUC and its affiliates in the different countries on migration. Paragraph 21 in the Kathmandu Declaration on Migration really emanates from there. I think that's a very concrete example. And of course, the work that you're doing in informing the unions itself, the advocacy that you're doing with different governments. I mean, I can go on and on. So thanks so much. I want to do 1 minute, Laxmanji, if you could quickly come back on this. How do you partner with other stakeholders? There are employers, there are civil society organizations, there are governments, there's a whole range of stakeholders. Give me one example, 1 minute. So what would be that one example?
1 minute, 2019, February, in Delhi, we signed a understanding with South Asian Federation of Employers in Delhi. And they said that we will collaborate with you on migration.
Right.
And we are doing that. And in Nepal also, in other countries also, we are individually, country to country, we are working together with them. But unfortunately, this pandemic has stopped the movement, but we are talking on the internet. Thank you.
Right. No, this is fantastic. I think you're once again, it's the South Asian Forum of Employers and the Sartuk conversations in February 2019, and I was there for those conversations. It was really first of its kind. And there are other examples. The ASEAN Confederation of Employers and the ASEAN Trade Union Confederation have also come along the same line. So this is fantastic. I think there is so much that we can exchange across the board as well. And that brings me to perhaps the conversation also takes me to women and domestic workers, Elizabeth. Here's a big question. C189, right? I mean, this is the big question on everybody's mind. I mean, Shannon was speaking about international labor standards. For me, that's as much a tool as it is an instrument, as it is a standard, as it is a normative framework. And this year marks the 10th anniversary of the adoption of C189. Which includes specific provision on the recruitment of migrant workers. Elizabeth, what progress have we made? Where have we gone? Have we gone any place? Over to you, Elizabeth.
Thank you. Thanks for this opportunity. We are very excited that this year we will celebrate so much achievements on the ratifications of the Convention 189. It affirms that domestic workers are workers and should be accorded with labor rights protection, same as any other workers. And over the last 10 years since the adoption, we have observed that there is increased awareness, not just among the migrant domestic workers themselves, but also a range of stakeholders of the specific challenges faced by migrant domestic workers generally. And thanks to trade unions and other CSOs, the ILO and other UN bodies, governments, which have released reports, information, conduct debate, discussions, and international forums through different international processes, including the GCM, that has led to government and business to make a lot of commitments, recognitions to improve the situation, to address some of the key challenges. So we have seen legal reforms that have taken place and practical measures have taken place to improve. And we have seen now there are legislations, regulations on weekly rest for migrant domestic workers, agency fees being regulated. Migrant domestic workers in many countries have access to the justice systems and shelters. Even in some countries, shelters are put in place to help domestic workers when they are seeking justice, and there are also legal support so that they can access the justice system. But for the IDWF and for migrant domestic workers, we think the most important progress is the increasing voice of migrant domestic workers. And we have to thank the migrant domestic workers themselves, despite all the challenges facing them, not least the freedom of association deficits. They break silence and speak out for their rights. Migrant domestic workers organization nowadays exists in almost all the major countries of destination. In some places, migrant domestic workers are the only migrant workers who have organized themselves. And with that, they try to gain access to all kinds of platforms and processes, often with the help of trade unions and other allies, to make their voice heard, leading to policy reforms, leading to practical measures implemented. This is the most important changes, achievements in the last 10 years, I must say. And this will continue to be the most potential, the most important potentials for change in the future.
Oh, brilliant. I think you give us such a positive, despite the challenges, the fact that we are taking steps forward. The fact that you've said, Elizabeth, that migrant domestic workers are the only migrant workers, perhaps in some countries, who've been able to organize themselves. I think that in itself is such a big step forward, isn't it? I'm constantly I'm constantly struck by the strength of the woman who is employed in a private household. The invisible faces that they are, in the context. I mean, a lot of the migrant workers are also in informal situations of work, and informality is such a big aspect of labor in general. I mean, I come from a country where over 90% of the workers are in the informal sector. But just along those lines, then, how do we link it to the commitment of employers? Because these are not employers who are members of big chambers of commerce and industry, or employers' federations, like the ones that the ILO really speak to, who are ILO's constituents. But then we try and engage with these private employers who don't come under the labor enforcement scanner, like what Shannon was referring to earlier. What exactly, what would be that message from your side for such employers and business in general to achieve this ambitious goal of protection that we're talking about for migrant domestic workers?
Yeah, for sure. We welcome the commitment of employers, governments, business to improve the situation for migrant domestic workers, such as to eliminate recruitment fees for migrant domestic workers. It would definitely improve the situation. It will improve a big obstacle to fair recruitment and decent work for migrant domestic workers. But what we need now is actions. Law and regulations have to be put in place and have to be implemented to make this happen in real life. Pledges are good, but not enough. And we have had a lot in the last 10 years. And now when we go into another new 10 years, we like to see concrete actions. People, migrant domestic workers, especially the migrant domestic workers themselves and their employers, need to be informed of the new policies, of the new changes. And there has to be complaint mechanism which is accessible to all the migrant domestic workers in case there is violations. And finally, there has to be penalty for the infringing agencies. So government have a big role to play. And from many reports, information, we know that employers are some. So we think that even with good policy in place, effective communication is vital. And government must see to this happen to ensure that everyone in the community, especially the employers, knows what is the right thing to do. So we all believe that happy workers deliver good result of the work, and they deserve to be treated better. So, and then finally, we must understand, as Sharon have said in the beginning, that the recruitment problem, recruitment fee is just the symptoms. We have to tackle the systemic challenges. We have to tackle the systemic issues. And we believe that the first and foremost, migrant domestic workers must be organized. And we have to recognize the fact that freedom of association, the right to collective bargaining, is still denied to domestic workers, especially when they are migrants in almost all the countries of destination. And this has to be addressed. It has to be changed so that migrant domestic workers can freely speak out and can be an agent of change more effectively.
Now, thanks. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Once again, I think, with all the work that IDWF is doing, your affiliates are doing in South Asia, for instance, I know that SEVA, the Self-Employed Women's Association in India, for instance, is a very active advocate on this, works very closely with IDWF as well. So really, I think, this has been so important along so many different perspectives. So thank you very much to all the four trade union leaders. Just so that I inform the audience, in fact, we were hoping, and you can put the blame on me, we were hoping to show you a video on a very important trade union initiative to promote fair recruitment. And this is specifically on the Migrant Recruitment Advisor. I know that my colleagues, Maria Galotti, Heike, and the others who are here will certainly be sharing that with all the participants so that you can watch it. We're close to the end of our time, but I must say this, there has been so many active, interesting questions from the participants. And this is really also about hearing from those on board. Here's what I will do. I'm going to take my liberty as a moderator and try and kind of amalgamate some of these questions together so that we can see how best this links in for all of you. I want to perhaps start with Brother Hasan. Brother Hasan, I think it's very important that you know this. This comes from one of our good friends in Nepal, Mr. Sunil Nyupane, who says that Nepalese workers who have been working in Bahrain feel safe. Those who are in contact, particularly those who are in contact with GFBTU leaders or Nepali community leaders there. So thank you, GFBTU, for your support, is what our brother from Nepal says, Sunil says. And Sunil, thanks so much for putting that on. I think it's important. One of the things that I believe is so important is actually being able to build this trust, right? I mean, it's so important in these perspectives. But let me follow that up to a question to both Brother Hasan and to Shannon as well. Maybe Elizabeth, you could come in on this as well. I'm curious to know, particularly in the context, and this is actually one of the questions that has come in, is more practical ways in which GFBTU has managed to address the challenges that you mentioned. So, Brother Hasan, you spoke about language barriers, cultural differences, issues with accessibility or time availability for migrant workers. What has GFBTU done on this? But then if I were to link that with another question is, migrant workers have experienced xenophobia across the board. They have experienced racism. A lot of the treatment has also been racist in nature. Let's not brush it under the carpet. And this is not just, I know that in South Asia, migrant workers within South Asia have that problem as well. So this is across the board. When you are going from one country to another country, it becomes an us versus them situation. So what kind of programs, activities do you think, implement that needs to be implemented to reduce such problems? So it's really a mixture of two questions here. And I will have both, all three of you, Brother Hasan, Shannon, and Elizabeth, quickly come back with your reflections on this. Brother Hasan, do you want to go first?
شكرا صابر. أنا أعتقد أن المشاكل مثل ما أشرت أنت في كلامك أصبحت ذات ثيمة واحدة ومتشابكة ومتشابهة في جميع الدول. أنا قلت في بداية كلامي نحتاج أن نخرج من الأنماط الاعتيادية. يجب أن يكون هناك مسؤولية كبيرة علينا نحن كمؤسسات ومنظمات نقابية، مؤسسات مجتمع مدني، أن نحمل على عاتقنا قبل أن نلوم العمال البسطاء الذين يأتون من بلد المنشأ إلى بلد المقصد ويجدون نفسهم في ظروف لا يحسدون عليها. أقول يجب أن تكون المسؤولية الكبرى علينا نحن من نفهم ونعي هذه الحقوق، ويكون علينا دور أكبر في التواصل مع بعضنا البعض وأن نكون صادقين في كيفية حلول هذه المشاكل. لا يكفي أن ننظم العمال في المنظمات النقابية وهم لا يعون ماذا عليهم وماذا يجب أن يفعلون. ما هي الواجبات التي يقومون بها، وما هي الحقوق التي يجب أن يتمتعون بها. هذه الأمور باتت اليوم أمور بسيطة جدا، وجربنا فيها الكثير من التجارب. الاتحاد العام طبع مئات الآلاف من المنشورات ب7 لغات، وقمنا بزيارات عديدة، وأرسلنا مندوبين إلى جميع قطاعات العمل في البحرين، وأعطيناهم أرقام وهواتف الاتحاد العام للتواصل في حالة وجود أي شكوى أو أي عنف يقع على العمال أو أي حق انتهك. ولكن مع الأسف كان الريسبوند أو التجاوب ضعيف جدا جدا جدا. إذن هناك مسؤولية وهناك مناطق يجب أن نطرقها الآن. بعد كل هذا العمل مع جميع المنظمات وكل هذه السنين، يجب أن تكون هناك حوصلة ونتائج، أن ما نقوم به هو اعتيادي جدا. يجب أن نقوم بشيء مختلف، يجب أن تكون هناك تشابكات، يجب أن يطلع كل اتحاد وكل منظمة بمسؤولية أكبر مما هي عليه، أن لا يشعر بالارتياح بأنه تواصل مع العمال وحاول أن يحل مشاكلهم. يجب أن تكون هناك إذا صح التعبير مفاوضات على مستوى القمم بين المنظمات.
Go ahead.
أكمل أم؟
Go ahead. Finish what you're saying.
يجب أن تكون هناك مؤتمرات وتفاهمات على مستوى القمم بين المنظمات بماذا يجب أن يقوم الاتحاد البحريني GFBTU، وماذا يجب أن يقوم الجيفنت في مثلا في نيبال وإليزابيث مثلا من موقعها، ومن ثم نضع خطط مشتركة كل يتحمل مسؤوليته في إيصال هذه الخطط إلى أهداف محددة يجب أن نصل. يعني كما أشار لاكسمان، بعد 100 سنة نحن نكرر نفس الأخطاء ونسير على نفس الأنماط. يجب أن نخرج من هذا الصندوق إلى منطقة أخرى. كيف؟ يجب أن نتشاور على هذا الأمر.
Fantastic. What a great way a great message to take. But it's also worrying when these problems have been happening for the last 100 years. How exactly are we going to resolve them? But the fact that you actually say that is important, reiterating that, I think is very important. Shannon, your reflections.
Yeah, well, of course, I think, it's important to understand that within at least the U.S. labor movement, our membership, we strive to make it look like our workforce. We do not have separate structures for migrant workers, but try to ensure that all workers in our industries are members of our unions, whether they're refugees or asylum seekers or on temporary visas or have no papers. It's our job to represent all workers. But it requires very intentional strategies to make that happen, to help workers understand that actually through being part of a collective movement, they actually can make themselves more safe, gain more rights. And that means that we need organizers who speak the languages of the workers, understand their needs, their issues, their communities, and that we need to be really visible as a movement in fighting for the issues that migrant workers face, whether that's with the employer in specific industry cases or with the government trying right now to correct from the injustices that we saw under the Trump administration that had migrant workers directly in the target zone, right? And so I think it's through unity, through intentionality, and building a shared struggle for all workers. We can't move forward when we accept tiered rights for workers in our labor market. So unity is the path and the way that we make progress. And migrant workers bring so much vitality and energy and new strategies and tactics to our labor movement. This is definitely part of the future of how we grow stronger as a global workers movement.
Oh, brilliant, Shannon. When you talk about no separate structures for migrant workers, I'm wondering how that exactly would link into the kind of work that GFBTU is doing in organizing migrant workers specifically. Yeah? And what kind of conversations can we have between migrant workers who are being unionized and the national workers in Bahrain, Bahrainis themselves. But I love this, Shannon. Unity, intentionality, and shared struggle. 3 big words and 3 big terms there that I would like to take with me as well. Elizabeth.
I share a lot of what Shannon has said. Migrant domestic workers actually have a lot of potential and capacity to organize. Even though the jobs they do, are often being seen as work of no values, but the workers themselves surely have the potential to organize. And we have seen that in many countries of destination, migrant domestic workers themselves have first come together as informal groups, as community groups, and that is what we have to go to them, to learn from them, and to start organizing together with them. So what we need to do is really to help workers from the country of destination to connect with migrant domestic workers as workers. Connect workers as workers, but not as people of other nationality and see them as people of other races. But we need to help workers to connect each other as workers. And that is the first step we have to take. And of course, we have to continue to fight, especially trade unions and all the other stakeholders, to make sure that the basic workers' rights, human rights, the rights to freedom of association has to be put in place. And unfortunately, this is still being denied in most of the country of destinations. And these rights have to be installed so that migrant domestic workers can effectively use their tools.
No, thank you. Thanks, Elizabeth. I'm just thinking when you say connect workers with each other as workers and not as races and not as nationalities and ethnicities and all of that, well, it's all about workers and it's all about trade unions. And this is really where you come in, right? And that's something that ILO, this is what makes it such a big moment of pride for me to work with the International Labour Organization and work with our trade union constituents and our employers' constituents along these very same lines. Laxmanji, one small question, and perhaps even as a concluding remark that you could consider here is a question that's come from one of the participants is, what's the common agenda among trade unions on migration? What's that one agenda? I mean, the affiliates for SARTUC in South Asia is GFONT, NTUC, is SEVA, is INTUC in India, it's NCCWE in Pakistan, it's the in Bangladesh, it's the Pakistan Workers Federation. You have a whole range of affiliates, 16 or so affiliates, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, so what is the common agenda on migration for the unions in South Asia? Laxmanji, you're on mute.
The first of all is justice for the migrant workers. And to get the justice, you have to organize. And to organize, ask the government to register the informal workers. And not the government, the migration should be handled in the local government. The recruitment should start in the local government. Pre-departure skill development should start with the local government. Municipalities, village level municipalities, so that the life starts in the villages. You have to bring the local government. This is what I am doing right now, trying to convince the local government. Okay,
fine. But what is the common agenda? Where would all the trade unions find a commonality?
Commonality is common people's voice. Democracy is the collaboration. Collaboration is the Otherwise, the common voice in South Asia is getting weaker and weaker and weaker. If you ask me, I would say if the trade union is weaker, the organized sector will be weaker. And the common voice of the common people will be vanished.
Brilliant. Brilliant. I mean, that's a fantastic way of putting it, isn't it? If you can, organize the workers, that actually strengthens trade union, and that should be the common agenda. Thank you for that. Democracy, collaboration, common voice. I mean, all of this, I'm going away with so much here. Really, I mean, we've overshot this panel by 15 minutes, but it was so important, so inspiring to say the least, listening to all four of you in your capacity, in your leadership capacity, really bringing the whole issue of migration together for trade unions. Something, and I'm going to come back to you. I'm going to keep coming. We're all going to, ILO officials are going to keep coming back to you and say, right, so let's take this, let's use this momentum, let's sustain this momentum. Thank you so much, Brother Hasan, Sister Shannon, Brother Laxman, and Sister Elizabeth, for really, really so much of inspiring perspectives, and not only inspiring, but your practical experience. I think we're ever so grateful for that. In Asia, it's now, at least in India, it's 8:45 in the evening. It's 8:45 here, and which means obviously all those who are here from Asia are participants. Big thanks to all of you and to all the others from around the world who are tuning in. Big thanks to our IOM and IHRB colleagues who have been working with ILO in organizing this forum. And of course, to Maria Galotti, Heike Lautenschlager, our colleagues from the technical team who have done such a fantastic job. To all of you, big thanks. Thank you very much all. Wish you a very good evening and a good day wherever you are. Thank you.
Thank you, Brother Sabri.